Hello guys. From this point forward, you're probably going to notice a big change in terms of how these videos are done. I decided to change the format, and what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to actually do it by chapter in which my students are reading. So this video represents chapter 5 of the Eric Foner book, Give Me Liberty. My previous videos were done in terms of the key concepts for AP US history. I decided to change because I think this is what my students need a little bit more, but still addressing the concepts under AP US history. Another thing I'm going to make a change is keep my mistakes in the videos. I spent a lot of time editing out and cutting videos, which was very time consuming. And unfortunately, the last time I made a video had been a while. Just for the fact that I need to focus on grading and actually teaching in the classroom. So I had to take a departure from actually producing the videos for a long time. So this video represents a new way of doing it. And it's not going to be as cleanly edited. You're going to see all my mistakes, my uhs, my ahs, my brain farts, if you will, and moments to think, instead of just having a continuous a lecture for the videos. So bear with me. If I get caught up in something, please forgive me, and I will do my best to continue on. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that I want to point out is I'm going to break it up. Instead of key concepts or a video working on a key concept, I'm going to focus on the objectives and the sections of the chapter of the book. So the first thing I want to really look at is, how does this American Revolution start? Okay, of course, part of the bigger context is you have the French and Indian War, which evolves into the 7 Years' War, which is a larger scale war and more expensive war, to the beginnings, the very beginnings of colonial uprising, the very beginnings of colonial pushback, and the end of solitary neglect. And it begins here with the Sugar Act, Stamp Act. So my objective is to understand how the Sugar Act and Stamp Act will impact the colonies. The first thing is we have to discuss some of the broader context in the colonies in terms of the Enlightenment. So in the previous chapter, we had discussed some of these Enlightenment and its influence with Montesquieu, Robespierre, John Locke, Voltaire. And now we're focused on how these ideas have kind of permeated the colonies over this course of the 1700s. So by the time you have the French and Indian War, many intellectuals and even regular people at the time are actually discussing politics in terms of these ideas. They're inspired by Enlightenment. You have these ideas of republicanism, this idea that people that own land kind of have a vested interest in the government, that they should participate in the government as well. And that's unique because in the colonies, colonists own land proportionally at a much bigger rate than people back home in England. So this is really going to get the colonies more accustomed to participating in their local colonial assemblies, and their local colonial assemblies have a lot of power over the colonial government, over the governor of their colony. So you have this tradition in the colonies already set up of people participating in government and seeing their laws carried out through their local colonial assemblies. You also have this idea of liberalism. It's not the same thing of what we call liberal today. Liberalism is, I guess, derived from these ideas of John Locke, that you have people that should have the least amount of government, that people should have a say in that government, and that they have natural rights, and these natural rights should be protected. And when this first starts with the Stamp Act and, of course, the previous Sugar Act, leaders were feeling that there's going to be limits to these freedom. Okay, leaders were feeling that there's going to be a problem here, and this idea that over the course of the past 1700 years, you have this salutary neglect. In other words, there had been a lot of laws passed by Parliament that colonists simply refused. and Parliament simply didn't enforce. So you had this other issue too of Parliament and the Crown and the government of Britain not really having their hands on the colonies as much. So the colonists were used to a degree of independence. But the thing was, after the French and Indian War, and to a large extent the 7 Years' War, it left England with a colossal debt. And especially after Pontiac's Rebellion, you have England tired of the colonies constantly causing problems. And the other issue is the amount of smuggling going on, the amount of issues in terms of the colonies not sticking to the Parliament laws that are trying to keep that income within the empire, that is trying to control the economy. On a side note, keep in mind some of these things that I'm outlining here are going to come up later on in terms of how much does the government control the economy, how much laws are set up when we talk about the Constitution. So part of the complaints, the grievances, if you will, of the colonies will be addressed later on in the format of the Constitution and the format of what the United States government should and shouldn't do. So keep that as a side note for later on. But like I mentioned, you have the Wool Act, the Molasses Act, the Iron Act. You have all these series of laws that were supposed to be enforced that really were never enforced. And colonists just kept on ignoring them. They kept on doing what they wanted. So this is the end of solitary neglect. This is the end of basically Britain saying, we're going to ignore these things. So in the 1760s, you had this huge debt, and you have Great Britain go ahead and say, we're going to go ahead and make the colonies have their fair share. Part of the other reason, the logic from the British point of view, is this idea that British citizens in the mainland, back home, they're paying a tremendous amount of taxes already. They're already paying a lot of taxes. In comparison, the colonists pay very little in taxes. And Great Britain saying, why are we letting this happen? We have this huge debt, and the source of the 7 Years' War, the source of the French and Indian War, were the colonists themselves. The source of Pontiac's Rebellion were colonists going west and causing conflict with Native Americans. And time again, the British military had to intervene on behalf of the colonists. It is now time for the colonists to pay their share of the burden. So this begins with the Sugar Act. So in 1764, you had basically the courts shift according to this law that if someone's caught smuggling, that they would go to the Admiralty courts. Admiralty courts? I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. But they would go to these courts, but the distinction here is they would no longer have a jury. And to colonists, they had been accustomed to a trial by jury. Sound familiar? So they felt like this was a problem, and this was a violation of rights. Along with the Revenue Act, this hurt profits of some of the colonists. Not all of the colonists, but some to take notice and say, this is violating our rights. This is violating our ability to provide for ourselves. But for the most part, this was an indirect tax because they wanted to curtail the smuggling and a way to, and keep that money from leaving the empire. There was a lot less colonial outrage, but the idea that a precedent had been changed, an idea that a right that they had been accustomed to had now been changed. The thing that was more of an outrage to colonists was the Stamp Act of 1765. Any paper product had to have this stamp, not this stamp in particular. This is a protest. This picture right here. This is a protest to the Stamp Act, but it had to have a royal stamp, a stamp that basically said that this paper product had paid the taxes, and those taxes were passed on to the consumers. So everyone felt a rise in price. And no one likes a rise in price. But the thing that they're going to take issue with is the idea that this law was passed with no input from the colonies. There was not a single representative in Parliament from the colonies that said, we're okay with this, or they're not okay with this. They didn't have a choice to voice their concern. And the colonies are going to say, this is a problem. We are accustomed to having a say in our colonial assemblies. Remember, you have republicanism in the colonies. They're used to having a say. And because they didn't have a say, they're arguing this tax violates our rights as British citizens. It violates our rights that we should have a say in the government, whether it gets passed or not. We did not have a say, hence no taxation without representation. The famous Patrick Henry idea, okay? That their property, their money was taken without their consent. So from the colonial perspective, this idea that the colonies, the colonists, and the people of England, they're equals. And as equal English subjects, they should be treated the same. And they should have the representative parliament as well. And Parliament shouldn't be able to just pass laws on individual colonists, without the permission of the colonists themselves through the representative. The British perspective, though, was that everyone is citizens of Great Britain. It is your duty as a subject of Great Britain to obey Parliament. There are people back home that don't have a vote. In fact, the vast majority of people back home in Great Britain do not have a vote, but they still have to obey. What makes the colonists any better? So that's definitely the British perspective, is that they feel that they have virtual representation. We have bakers here. You have bakers over there. You're represented. We have lawyers here. You have lawyers over there. You're represented. This idea of virtual representation from the British perspective. Regardless of that, the colonists formed the Stamp Act Congress. They met in New York to kind of figure out how they're going to protest this, how they're going to do this. And out of that came this large boycott. But the Stamp Act Congress is significant because now you have the first ideas of the colonists kind of like getting together, actually communicating with each other. Because if you recall in previous chapters, the colonists in the 13 colonies were pretty much separate. They didn't really view themselves as Americans. They viewed themselves as Virginians. They viewed themselves as New Englanders. They viewed themselves as New Yorkers. The Stamp Act Congress is kind of slowly breaking down that barrier for them to start talking to each other for the first time. But through these discussions, you have a heightened sense of this idea of liberty. This word liberty is catching on and is being used in a lot of different ways. And liberty this, liberty that. This idea of liberty is really taking over, in a way, the soul of the American people, these colonists. You have protests in which they hang people in effigy. If you don't know what hanging people in effigy is you basically create, I guess, a mascot of a person, and you hang that mascot from a tree in protest to what that person's doing. So the tax collectors for the Stamp Act, the Stamp Act distributor in Boston, they were hung in effigy. They're like a doll representing that person in protest. I know we would be horrified today of seeing something like that, but that's how they protested back then. And they called that tree the Liberty Tree. A Liberty Hall is a space under the tree where they basically got together to discuss these issues at the time. In New York, you had this pole where people met. It was called the Liberty Pole. So this idea of liberty is really become a big part of the American vernacular. It's becoming a big part of how people are talking, and a big part of resistance, that they are violating our liberty. Having said that, you also have the masses rise up and do things to enforce this behavior. So crowds enforce administrators, whether through intimidation or straight up violence. You have tar and feathering. Tar and feathering was a horrible thing. Hot tar was poured on people and they were covered in feathers, which caused a very serious injury to people. But the working classes that were feeling the brunt of these taxes, or the Stamp Act and other things later on, They were become the physical force of this resistance. Sons of Liberty were very popular among the working class in Boston, especially. They're the ones that enforced the boycott, that kind of push, I guess, bullying tactics, if you will, or this social kind of behavior that you will not do this because it is unpatriotic. These tactics were so successful and put so much pressure on the merchants back home in England that the merchants spoke up and actually put pressure on Parliament to repeal it. And by 1766, you actually have Parliament repeal the Stamp Act. So the colonists feel this is kind of like positive reinforcement. See, we were on the right side here. Look what Parliament did. It does. The system works. We spoke up. We voiced our concern. We protest. And Parliament changed. Parliament, though, is going to have a different perspective. Parliament is going to basically say, we're going to repeal this, but we have the right to pass any future law we want on the colonies. The colonists do not have the right to disobey any kind of laws. You also have this issue in other parts of the colonies where through this tension, other things come to the surface like class difference. In rural areas, essentially in North and South Carolina, they feel people in the cities were kind of elitists and not really paying attention to the people in the backcountry. So you had this tension happening, and through the protests, you also have these other things happen. You have these other issues come to the surface that have been under the surface for a while. The people in the backcountry, in the rural areas, complained that the government was corrupt. They were just not listening to the people in the backcountry. So you had them angry at what they feel were this colonial elite in the cities, in the colonies. And they demanded a better access to Western land. Because remember, land is power, according to these colonists. And the people in the cities of the colonies they felt were keeping them from that access to land. In New York, you also had this class difference rise up in terms of tenants. And you had this uprising. You had Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys, who basically would create Vermont out of this revolt against wealthier people. So again, this revealed social class tensions. So that's one unique thing you're going to see here with the American Revolution, is that there are other problems that already existed between colonists themselves. And at this moment, when people are angry and feeling anger is rising, these other issues are going to come to the surface that are not necessarily directly related to the American Revolution. So in this section, we're going to understand how Great Britain and the English colonies increased their hostility towards each other based on different political understanding of the role of Parliament. So we're going to look at two big things. First, the Townsend Act and how the colonists and Great Britain reacts to that. And then the Tea Act and the ramping up of violence and essentially punishment, especially for the city of Boston in terms of that, and everything that surrounds those two issues. First thing is the Townsend crisis. So the Townsend duties, again, were a way to help the colonies pay for this. And you got to recall, when they ended the Stamp Act, Parliament did say they had the right to pass any laws that they see fit, and the colonies had to obey. Colonists did not walk away with that understanding necessarily from the Stamp Act. See, when these Townsend duties, they were a tax on all goods imported in the colonies. And part of the idea behind that is that this money, this revenue, would be used to pay for judges and governors. In other words, you have to remember that colonial assemblies are the ones that had a lot of power and in a way represented the people. The colonial assemblies were a check and balance against governors and paid the judges. So what Parliament's trying to do here is saying, we pay for the governors, we pay for the judges, they have to do what we want them to do now. And it kind of lessens the power of that colonial assembly. So it's bypassing that by changing how it's paid for. And the Townsend duties were there to pay for that. So again, the colonists in 1768 have a complete boycott, similar to what happened with the Stamp Act, to protest these new taxes on goods. Out of this, you have this famous pamphlet, John Dickinson, Letter from a Farmer from Pennsylvania. And in it, he explained the ideas and the Enlightenment in terms of the colonial perspective. He wanted to basically explain how the ideas of Enlightenment represent what the colonists are fighting for and how good government should work. And they, colonists, the Americans, felt there should be a debate among elites about these issues. There should be conversations. And Parliament should be involved in that. And Parliament does not feel they need to ask Americans what they should do or shouldn't do. So you have these intellectual arguments being formed through this process of protest. You also have women playing an integral role. Remember, women are the ones that are going to the markets and buying these goods that are being taxed. So if they're being boycotted, women have the burden of producing all these things, producing the clothing that otherwise they would have been buying in the marketplace. England itself, Great Britain itself, are the ones that produce the finished goods that the Americans usually bought. So without that anymore, it's up to the Americans to now produce this. And to a further degree, it's up to women to produce this. The boycott would not have been a success if it wasn't for women producing all these things, many of the things, and women choosing not to buy the things that were being boycotted. This also helped local artisans grow and not compete with England anymore. So it kind of nurtured artisans to have a little bit more ability to produce things as well. Tensions were rising in Boston. So in 1768, you have a riot break out, and you have a lot of laborers angry at the presence of troops. And some of the troops were actually taking some of the jobs from the laborers, and they were very resentful of that. And you have a situation where some of these people are throwing rocks and threatening the soldiers, and in the confusion, the soldiers fire into the crowd. And you have Crispus Attucks killed, and he's the first martyr of the revolution, if you will. And he was someone of mixed heritage. He was African American as well. And he would be the first one to die in terms of this revolution that's starting to occur. And what you have pictured here is the famous inaccurate depiction of it. And this was used as propaganda to get colonists riled up and to get them, on the side of what the colonists are fighting for. This caused so much problems. Eventually, like the Stamp Act, these duties were repealed with the exception of tax on tea. So tax on tea would still be a sore point for many of the colonists because they're having to pay more for that. So keep that in mind, because in 1773, Parliament passes the Tea Act. And essentially, you have the East India Tea Company that's not doing so well. And many people in Parliament are invested in this company. So Parliament goes ahead and grants them a monopoly that they do not necessarily have to pay the taxes that everyone else has to pay. And this really, hurts the merchants. This really hurts the local economy for the colonists, and to a certain degree the smugglers, because now this company legally can sell cheaper tea than anyone else and undercutting the competition. People in Boston are angry about that, so they disguise themselves as Native Americans, get onto a ship with the tea, and throw it overboard in the famous Boston Tea Party, December 16th, 1773. So when this happens, essentially Parliament's looking at this and saying, we cannot allow this to happen anymore. This is getting way out of hand, and essentially Boston is in a state of rebellion. So because of this, you have the enforcement of the Intolerable Acts. So remember, New England early on in colonial history very famously had these towns, and they had these town hall meetings, these local governments, these meeting places to discuss politics. The Intolerable Acts basically shut this down. no longer elected members to the council. And to add insult to injury, remember, New England society is very Protestant. They have a prejudice against Catholics. But after the French and Indian War, Quebec and the rest of Canada belongs to Great Britain. So Great Britain, Parliament with the Quebec Act extends the boundary of Canada further south, and to Protestants, the Puritans, the great grandchildren of the Puritans, they're like, wait a second, what are the Catholics are inching closer to us? So this adds insult to injury that's already happening with the Intolerable Acts. So in the previous section, we saw a ramping up of tensions between Americans and the British, the ongoing issues with the Townsend Acts, and then finally with the Intolerable Acts. Now we need to focus on, in this section, how do these proud Englishmen, I use the term Americans interchangeably, but I mean Americans in terms of the continent they live on, but they still consider themselves proud Englishmen. How do we go from proud Englishmen to declaring independence? The idea that they are proud of their status of living in the English Empire to saying we're going to remove ourselves. So how do we get from point A to point B? In 1774, many of the colonists were opposed to these Intolerable Acts. It wasn't just isolated to New England, especially in the South and especially in the North. There were people that were against it. So they were united in opposition to what was happening with the Intolerable Acts. So out of this, you have the Continental Congress was created to kind of organize this resistance against these Intolerable Acts, to organize resistance against what the British were doing. But again, they're not talking about independence. They're talking about resistance to air their grievances and hopefully have their grievances met by Parliament. They're not actually talking about separation at this point. And delegates from all over the colonies were sent, except for Georgia. Georgia did not participate in this. But essentially, you had, for the most part, a consensus that these things need to stop. They had no idea that this path would eventually lead to independence at this point, despite this being only 2 years removed from the Declaration of Independence. That was not the path they had set out to do. And so they agreed on the Suffolk Revolts. They were basically going to organize and refuse obedience to these new laws and not actually pay the taxes and prepare for actual fighting. So you might think to yourselves like, well, they're fighting, they're declaring independence, they're breaking away. They're fighting in the sense as English citizens, but not fighting for independence. They're fighting in terms of resistance and not to obey, but not in terms of independence. So they did not declare independence at this point. You have the committees of safety organized, and they were created to kind of oversee and enforce the things created by the Continental Congress. A lot of them were made of regular people. But in essence, what this does for a lot of people, a lot of Americans, a lot of colonists, was give them the experience in politics, but also reflect this political power of the people. So the committees of public safety were largely regular citizens enforcing what the Continental Congress decided, but it's giving them experience in government. In other words, we're foreshadowing this idea that you have more people participating in government once America does declare independence, and this is where they got their feet wet. Despite the Continental Congress not really declaring war or fighting for independence, you have war actually come to New England. In April 1775, you have the battles of Concord and Lexington, and essentially the British wanted to take away the weapons in Concord. So they're marching towards the armory to do it, and along the way, skirmishes break out, and out of this, you have an army being formed that will be led by George Washington to fight against the British. So still, with the fighting, with the bloodshed, the first people dying in the Battle of Lexington Concord, you still do not have a move for independence. In fact, in this context, you have this idea that they're so proud of being Englishmen. In the mindset of the Americans at this time, they feel they're fighting for their English rights in terms of English heritage, and the ideas going all the way back to the Magna Carta. They feel like they're fighting for their ideas as Englishmen. And they worried that if independence was actually declared, that because you don't have the English Empire, because you don't have this form of government, they feel that anarchy will set in. Without this government, without the English government, you will have chaos. But you do have a very vocal group in New England and in the South support move towards independence. New York and Pennsylvania were a little bit mixed on the idea of actually declaring independence. It's not till 1776, and I'm not talking about July 1776, January 1776, earlier in the year, where you have Thomas Paine's Common Sense come out. And this was done right after you have the colonies, the Americans, sent out what's called the Olive Branch Petition to try and get a dialogue going from the British and the Americans to have peace and still remain a part of the empire. So when he wrote this, he's completely departing from this idea of let's stay together. He wants to say we need to break away, we can form our own country, and he's using the arguments of the Enlightenment. But here's the difference between, say, something what Thomas Paine writes and what Dickinson writes earlier, is this idea that he's using common language. To give you an idea what that means is when people wrote back then, they usually wrote for other intellectuals, other elites to read. They used Latin phrases that only educated people would understand. What Thomas Paine's departure is, he's using the language of the people. He's using the regular language that almost all Americans can understand, and a lot of Americans can read at this time, but they cannot read Latin. So he's using a very common vernacular, and he's speaking to the people in this sense. And there's other contemporaries of his time, like John Adams, that did not like what he was doing because he felt that he was pandering to the masses. But Thomas Paine's work was very, very powerful. It was very powerful in the sense that it moved people and it pushed the momentum, I guess, if you will, the paradigm, to more independence. So it's not a coincidence that you have 6 months later, you have the July 4th, 1776, the famous Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson originally, he was going to include this idea, this criticism against the British Empire for the slave trade. The hypocrisy being, of course, Thomas Jefferson is a slave owner himself, but in terms of the slave trade and the brutality of the slave trade. But Georgia and South Carolina intervened and said, let's not include that for obvious reasons that Georgia, South Carolina is heavily vested in slavery. And then you have this idea that English rights, this transition for this idea that it's English rights that we're fighting for, to essentially it's natural rights of all mankind. So you have this shift in thinking here that these rights are not uniquely English. Okay, these rights are made for everybody. And of course, Thomas Jefferson writes, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, unalienable rights, but he's definitely, without a doubt, heavily influenced by John Locke, because John Locke believed in natural rights and life, liberty, and property. So these are heavily laced with the ideas of the Enlightenment, especially John Locke. So in this last section, I just really want to focus on essentially how the actual war went. And part of this class is we're really not going to focus on a lot of battles, a lot of fighting, which is important for history. It's understanding what happened in these battles. But in terms of this class, a survey class of U.S. history, we're going to talk about some of the major turning points and the larger implications of the war itself. So the objective is to understand how the actual fighting of the war impacted the colonists and how they gained independence. So the war, essentially from 1775 to 1783, you had about 200,000 men fight in this war. Okay. And for the most part, especially for the British, this would be very, very costly, a very expensive war, because yet again, this thing that starts in the colonies gets expanded, especially when we started including the French and the Spanish, gets expanded to a larger conflict. And if you guys recall, the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War, had already put the British Empire in a colossal amount of debt. So this war, to try and rein the colonies in, is going to be very, very expensive for the British itself. And the British themselves did not really fully understand the cultural change that had happened, the social change, the political changes that had happened over the course of 100 years or so in the Americans. They had fundamentally grown apart, but they just didn't realize it at the time. Neither did the Americans, for the most part, realize at the time that they had grown so much apart in terms of their understanding of how the relationship was. Sorry, I think I skipped a slide. Okay. All right. The other thing that we have to discuss in terms of this war is African Americans in the actual revolution. So we'll talk about this a little bit more next chapter, but definitely African Americans were influenced and in turn influence what was going on in this revolution. George Washington at first, being a Virginian, being a slave owner, did not want to use black troops as soldiers. But he was undermined by what the British did. Lord Dunmore's proclamation in 1775 basically said, if you fight for the British, you will be free. And you have American slaves running away, including George Washington's own slaves that he brought with him, ran away to go fight for the British against the Americans. Okay? So when this started happening, Washington's hand was forced, and he did allow black troops to be a part of the American Revolution. On a side note here, this would be the last time that black and white troops would fight for the United States until the Korean War. Okay? So it would be a long time after the American Revolution before black and white troops fight together. For the most part of American history, until the Korean War, black and white troops will be segregated. So up to this point, before the Battle of Saratoga, Washington did not have much success. He did not have a lot of victories against the British in terms of battles. He did try to boost morale by having a surprise attack on Hessian soldiers around Christmas. But really, aside from that, he did not have a lot of success until the Battle of Saratoga in October 1777, excuse me. With this battle is very important, because what the Battle of Saratoga does is let other nations know that the Americans are serious, that there is some hope that they actually might beat the British. Once the French see this, because Benjamin Franklin is already in France at this time trying to negotiate France's help. Once the French sees this victory at Battle of Saratoga, the French come in to help out. And for the most part, if it wasn't for the French, the Americans would probably have no success in actually beating the British. So once the French come into this war, it expands the war, and it gives the Americans a fighting chance here. The war shifts from the New York area in the north, the Canadian area, to the south. Essentially, the British wanted to exploit the problems between the rural areas in the backcountry and the cities, the elites. And they felt that there would be enough loyal sentiment against the elites that the British could exploit that. So they really wanted to take advantage of that, so they shifted the war to the south. And this was kind of a war of attrition, okay? The Americans knew that they could not really compete with the British in a full front, traditional battle. So you had these hit and run tactics that they kept on using through the South that essentially just wore the British down and kept them from having any kind of total victory. The British in turn would use tactics against people in the South, very brutal tactics, that eventually would turn people that were on the fence, people that really weren't deciding if they were on the British or loyal side. It would push them to the side of the Americans by the actions of the British themselves. So actually, in some way, the British kind of shot themselves in the foot by pushing away people that otherwise wouldn't have joined the Americans by the tactics they were using in the South. And then finally, because of this war of attrition and because of this slowly wearing down the British, you have essentially the British try to regroup themselves at Yorktown. And when Washington sees that the British are in Yorktown along the Chesapeake, they feel now is our chance to surround them. So Washington, largely met by a majority French force and with the support of the French Navy, of course, surrounds Yorktown, and it was a complete miscalculation on the side of the British. When this happens and word gets back to Great Britain that they have lost Yorktown, essentially the British give up. They want to cut their losses and say, you know what, we just need to give up this. And part of the reason is, to the British, it really doesn't matter because they still have the trade. They still have the advantage when it comes to the Navy. They still have the advantage when it comes to trade. And they're going to be right for a long time in terms of trade. That the British are going to control the trade in the West Indies, and once America gets formed, it's going to be really difficult to get in terms of that trade because the British will say, well, you want independence. There's your independence. We're not going to allow you to have trade with the West Indies. So you'll see that later on in later chapters, these growing pains that America's going to have, especially when it comes to the economy. But essentially, the British say, we're going to cut our losses. The Americans can have their independence. It's been too expensive, and we're going to leave it alone. And the Americans have independence. Surprising enough, shocking the Western Europe, the Americans are going to have independence, and they're going to start forming their own country. So from this point forward, you have this idea of the birth of the United States. It kind of starts in 1777 because you still have a government being formed in 1777, but finally, for sure, after Battle of Yorktown, you have this victory. In next chapter, we're still going to continue the American Revolution, but in the next chapter, we're going to talk mostly or discuss mostly the huge effects of the American Revolution, the implications of it. And then in chapter 7, we'll discuss the beginnings of the Constitution, or rather the Articles of Federation, and continue into the Constitution. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you guys in class. Have a good one, guys.